Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. My name is Andra Gonowella. Today, I'm delighted to have Eliot Higgins. Eliot is an award-winning journalist and the founder of the investigative journalism platform, Bellingcat. He is the author of We Are Bellingcat, an intelligence agency for the people, published in 2022. Bellingcat is a fact-checking platform that uses open-source intelligence, including videos, maps, and pictures, to enable citizen journalism on international affairs. The platform focused initially on Syria and the Middle East, with initial investigations focusing on the Syrian Civil War, Malaysian Air Flight 17, which was shot down, and the poisoning of a Russian dissident, but has since moved on to focus on the invasion of Ukraine. In addition to debunking propaganda, Eliot has a very fascinating backstory, a very interesting biography, which I really want to dig into, which is associated obviously with his founding of Bellingcat. But Eliot, thanks for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
So Eliot, can you give us a little bit of insight into how you actually began your career in citizen journalism? And I think really talk through maybe about that initial work on the Syrian Civil War.
So I have no background in intelligence journalism, investigation, or anything like that. Up until I started doing this work in 2011, had really worked in a series of admin jobs for various businesses, but I had a really keen interest in international affairs and politics. My childhood was basically bookended by the first war in Iraq and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So that, I think, for me was very formative. But it really was in 2011 with the Arab Spring when I started getting engaged with a lot of online debates and arguments about what was happening in places like Egypt and Libya and Syria on various forums and comment sections. And I was just like many other people who were having these same kind of arguments. But what was really different about what was happening in the Arab Spring was that there was a lot of content that was coming from those conflicts that came from people gathering it on their cell phones or rebel groups filming stuff themselves. So it was a whole new source of information that, in parallel to what we were getting from mainstream sources, seemed to actually show a lot more than actually those mainstream sources were able to show and present.
That's super interesting. So you're arguing in these comment sections. We have this sort of social media that's giving us a bunch of new information. I feel like when I often think about maybe like sources for journalism from social media, I think about the raid at Abbottabad that got bin Laden. I think there was the one guy who said, I hear helicopters outside my window. And then, later it's confirmed that that's the bin Laden raid sort of going on. So I guess, how did you initiate these methods? How do you start gathering this information? Like, what was the push that came to shove that I guess got you sort of enmeshed in these methods specifically?
I wish I could say there was some great humanitarian reason or, had some great goal, but it was really just me arguing with people on the internet and wanting to win and annoy them. So there was always a lot of videos that were being shared from Libya that had claims from one side or the other about what towns had been captured, what the videos were showing in terms of weaponry or, all kinds of different things. But you have a debate online between effectively two communities, the kind of pro Gaddafi type community, and then the kind of rest of the community. There were kind of a community of these people who were like anti-NATO, pro Gaddafi, and they would always say anything that shows, the Gaddafi side doing anything bad was fake and it wasn't real and they weren't losing this territory. But people would just argue about these videos without really analyzing them. And one day I shared a video that claimed a town had been captured in Libya, and there was someone who was a regular commentator said, well, how do you know where that's filmed? And I thought, actually, that's a reasonable question. How do you actually know where this stuff is filmed? And I saw there was this mosque in the video. It was next to this big road. It was supposedly in this fairly small town. So I went to Google Earth satellite imagery, found that big road, follow it along until I found a mosque that had the same features as the one in the video. And then I matched off smaller and smaller features like the utility poles. You could see the shadows they were casting in the satellite imagery, and basically matched the video to the location on the satellite imagery. And I said, look, it's filmed here. And that was really my first attempt at what we now call geolocation, but we didn't even have a word for it then. It was that kind of early on in this whole kind of development of open source investigation. But I just really kind of enjoyed the process of doing that. And I started doing that more and more. And again, mainly to win arguments on the internet. But I saw that, I was posting stuff on Twitter in the comments. I was getting like attention from the people who ran the Guardian Live blog and started putting some of my stuff in the actual main live blog. So that kind of just pushed me on to keep doing this. And in 2012, I started a blog called the Brown Moses blog, which was named after a Frank Zappa song I had been listening to when I picked this online pseudonym I'd been using, Brown Moses, and really just set myself the challenge every day to write something. And it wasn't necessarily that it was something that was particularly good, but it was more to just keep on testing myself, hone my skills, really discover more about what was happening in Syria at the time. And from there, I kind of built up a kind of catalog of the social media channels being used in opposition areas by media centers and coordination committees and arms groups that were operating there. And by looking at those every single day, I could actually start tracking certain things that were part of the conflict. And because I didn't speak Arabic, I was focused on what the videos were showing. And that was often the arms and munitions being used in the conflict. So using various online resources, I taught myself how to ID weapons. And in parallel to that, I kind of built a community of people who are like really, really into what was happening in Syria at the time. And I was a very unique source of information because I was the only one bothering to really look for these videos in a systematic way and then actually say what was in these videos. And some of that stuff ended up being very interesting.
So I guess where are these videos coming from? Were they sort of the videos that you were seeing on Twitter? Were they on sort of other apps, other websites?
So generally speaking, with Syria, you would have a group would have a YouTube channel, a Facebook page, and sometimes a Twitter account. So you could actually catalog all of these. And because there was limited internet access in those opposition-held areas, you generally didn't have that many social media channels in a certain town or village or district of a city. So you can actually go through and catalog all of these. And I actually put this catalog on my website. And I think I ended up in the end with maybe about 1,000 different YouTube channels. And every day I would go through and check them for the latest videos that have been posted there, looking for something that I hadn't seen before in other videos. And often it would be videos of kind of various armed brigades forming. It would be different bombs being dropped from planes. Sometimes it would be the remains of those munitions. It would be armed groups filming what their kind of activities and attacks. So I just kind of was always looking out for something that seemed new, unusual, or worth writing about in those videos. And that started off really being things like there was one terrible event called the Hula Massacre in 2012, where a village was attacked by pro-Assad forces, and women and children were killed on a large scale. And that's where all these videos that were being shared from about 5 accounts in the local area showed what was happening. And I tracked that. Then there were examples of cluster munitions being used for the first time in the conflict, and I was the first person to see that. And eventually that led to things like chemical weapons attacks being documented using these videos.
That's super interesting. And I mean, like when you're sort of doing this solo, in the early 2010s, 2011, 2012, were you getting any, like, what type of attention were you getting? You were certainly getting attention from folks in the community, but like, were you getting negative attention from time to time, sort of highlighting some of these atrocities in a way, well, not in a way, definite atrocities, obviously, but like you're able to find information that isn't publicly known, but yet is technically publicly available because of all the sources you're using.
Early on, it was really coming from what you could broadly call the pro-Assad community. The people who were either Syrians who were supporting Assad or Westerners who were supporting Assad, usually because of kind of their worldview. It was kind of what they would call probably themselves anti-imperialists, but really it's anti-Western. So they were really the ones who kind of started to argue with me on the internet a lot about these videos. But that's because I was very engaged with that on Twitter. I also built an audience of people who actually started to see these discussions, me presenting evidence, breaking stuff down, and seeing how much kind of value there was into what I was explaining. Because I was always very clear about my sources and the process I was going through in identifying stuff in these videos. Because I was nobody. No one had any reason to believe what I was saying, and I had read far too many blogs from people who saw a video from a place like Syria and then just kind of applied their own, political view to what was in the video. So if they saw a Caucasian-looking guy in a video from Libya, for example, they would say, "Oh, that's the CIA agent who's running everything," but it was usually just a journalist or something. So that really was the kind of community in 2012 who kind of engaged with me. And really, those kind of communities emerge around any topic. It can be anything from chemical weapons in Syria to the Earth being flat to COVID to MH17. You always have these kind of counter factual communities, as I call them, who really are the kind of the engine for a lot of kind of conspiracy theories and disinformation about what's happening in these conflicts.
So then, connect this. So 2012, you're focusing on the Syrian Civil War. 2014, you start Bellingcat. How did that journey sort of come about? Like, you're doing the solo. At what point did you realize that you wanted to form an organization around this type of work?
So in early 2013, I did an investigation that looked at weapons that had started appearing in videos from Syria that I hadn't seen before. I'd spent about a year at that point IDing weapons from Syria, bombs, rifles, manpads, rocket launchers. And these were things I'd never seen before. And I identified them and I realized they all had a connection to the former Yugoslavia. Either they were made there or they were known to be widely used there. And I took that to a New York Times journalist, CJ Chivers, who'd been following my work, particularly on manpads, since I had started doing stuff on Libya. And he and a number of journalists at the New York Times took this to various US government officials. And they said, this is, actually the secret Saudi arms smuggling operation they're doing through Jordan. And that ended up being a front page story on the New York Times. And that really lifted my profile a great deal. There was like a week in March where I had every day a different film crew from CNN and Channel 4 News in the UK and ARD in Germany come and film kind of me talking about all this stuff, which was like a very unusual experience for me because I'd never had any of this kind of attention before. But we then had the August 21st, 2013 sarin attacks. And by that time, I had built an audience among journalists and NGO workers for writing about Syria. And because I was the only person really systematically going through these videos publicly, I became a real source for actually details on what happened in that attack, the munition that was documented at the sites of these attacks, the various details about the victims. I've worked with Human Rights Watch as a consultant on that as well. And that kind of also, again, raised my profile quite a bit. And by that point, it was becoming more and more clear to me that other people wanted to do open source investigation. It was actually really valuable in understanding conflict. And I wanted to create a new site that wasn't my kind of terrible looking blogspot page, where I could both publish guides and case studies to teach people how to do this, and also give people who wanted to publish open source investigations a place where they could publish it. And that was Bellingcat, which was launched on July 14th, 2014. And at that time, I was thinking, what can I write about Syria? But then 3 days later, MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine. And that became a huge catalyst, both for my own work at Bellingcat, but open source investigation as a field in general.
Can you take us a little bit behind the scenes of that investigation into the shoot down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17? I'm really curious about like what did those methods look like, in under the new sort of platform of Bellingcat? I guess I'm also really curious about like how fast you were able to move with sort of gathering, collecting, and actually analyzing this information.
So when I launched Bellingcat, I was launching it with about £56,000 of Kickstarter funding I was trying to raise. It was basically just me and my spreadsheets and the website. But when MH17 was shot down, this community formed online very, very rapidly of people who were digging through this information. Some of them had very clear biases. Some were trying to kind of clear Russia's name. Some were trying to clear Ukraine's name, but they were all finding stuff. The thing is, Bellingcat and me was really the only place where anyone was really bringing this stuff together and publishing it. So because I had that following from journalists already, they were seeing what I was writing and publishing on the website that was kind of being drawn from these communities. I was able to verify things like geolocations and stuff like that. And very rapidly, I identified a small group of people who were doing really good work on their own, doing geolocations and digging through stuff on the Russian internet and stuff like that. And I reached out to them and said, hey, would you like to collaborate? And we just started, sending each other's messages, DMs. And soon we started finding out stuff that no one else was discovering because we were using these, what were to most people, completely new techniques, and certainly techniques that had been never used outside of the context of somewhere like Libya or Syria. So very, very quickly, we were able to, for example, track the route of the missile launcher that shot down MH17 through Ukraine on July 17th. We were able to show that it had headed to the launch site that was identified through open source photographs. We found lots of information about its origin from Russia because it was part of the missile launcher that shot down MH17 was part of a military convoy that had transported through Russia in June, a few weeks earlier, and that had been filmed and photographed by Russians on the ground. So we geolocated all those videos, put them in a route, identified all the vehicles, and realized that the markings on one of the vehicles matched exactly with missile launcher that was seen in July 17th in Ukraine. And from that, we were able to make lots and lots of kind of revelations that just really was not coming from anywhere else.
And I mean, because I remember when this happened, 2014, this is a huge story, a very tragic story. But I mean, on this sort of particular situation, it was such a geopolitical flashpoint, I think, for Russia, for the US. How did the media sort of engage with Bellingcat at this point? Like CNN, you mentioned Channel 4 earlier, who interviewed you over some of your work on Syria. How did the media engage with you? And then I mean, did the US government engage with you at all? Because I mean, if you're like the first one gathering all of this information in like one sort of central like repository, I feel like that's bound to get a ton of reactions.
Well, there were journalists on the ground who had followed Bellingcat's work, or rather the Brown Moses blog for a while, knew about Bellingcat, and they were seeing what we were publishing. And so, for example, we published location of one of the missile launcher photos from July 17th, and three different groups of journalists went to that location and interviewed people who said they had seen the missile launcher. Well, the first two said they had seen it, and by the time the third group had told there, everyone was denying everything, ever seeing any missile launcher anywhere in their lives. So they were able to actually see the work we were doing and then on the ground follow that stuff up, which then fed back into the work we were doing because we got further information, confirmation, and other little details that could help us understand what was happening. So we kind of integrated that into our understanding of what was happening. So generally, we had a kind of good relationship. We were still fairly unknown among kind of the editors of the world, I would say, but the journalists who are actually kind of more on the front lines of this kind of work, they kind of recognized the value of the work that we were doing, and we built a reputation up quite quickly there. In terms of the government, yeah, I think there was certainly interest in what we were putting out. I don't know really what they thought of it too much. I think over the years, the governments across the world have seen the value of open source investigation in various ways, both in understanding conflict and communicating what's happening. And I think that really kind of was demonstrated with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the US government was a lot more transparent about the information it had because they could refer to open sources when they were talking about it. And that was a real evolution from the position in 2014, where it's very difficult to get any information from any government apart from kind of vague allegations. So that kind of really evolved over time.
So who is Bellingcat actually? I mean, like, who are the citizen journalists who compose the organization? And like, I mean, you sort of started this by honestly like looking at a lot of different sources that you'd sort of come find on open source resources on the internet. But I mean, do you have folks who are on the ground in like say certain war zones, certain conflict zones, and certain political situations who are also doing this reporting?
It's pretty much everyone's working remotely in different ways. So Bellingcat as an organization has grown from 2014, when it was really just me and my blog and not very much money, to an organization now where we have 40 staff members based across the world. We're a fully fledged nonprofit in the Netherlands. We now have a US branch that's opening up, and we've got one in the UK that's opening up. And we've really kind of changed from what was really just my blog and a few volunteers to a full-fledged organization that has staff that, is a serious business, really. But the way we're actually organized is a bit unusual, I think. I often get asked how many volunteers you have, and that question is actually quite a difficult one to answer. So if you've got to imagine it kind of like an onion. So right at the center, you have the core Bellingcat team, which is the 40 staff members that we have, any contractors we might have on for specific projects as well. Then we have what we would call our kind of more regular collaborators, and they can be individuals or organizations that we work with on a regular occasion. And they could be media organizations, human rights organizations, legal organizations, as we do more work in the kind of justice and accountability sector, education-based organizations, because we do a lot of education as well. And those two layers we can sort of organize projects around. But then we have our kind of broader engaged community. So, for example, we have a Discord server that has about 30,000 members on it, and they will just dig into anything that takes their fancy. And that can be a really good source for stories that we might not otherwise look into. So recently there was a story we published about an oil spill off the coast of Trinidad and Tobago. And that community actually used the various tools and techniques that we've kind of shown them to use over the years to investigate that and identify where the oil leak came from, the ship that was responsible, where it had come from, showing it was part of oil smuggling operations, all this information that we then were able to run through our editors and turn into a publication that we put on the website, and that had a real impact. So we have this kind of engaged online community that can, it's Discord, it's the community that was on Twitter, which is really where the open source community came from. Then you have the kind of more broader internet community who's engaged with our work, but aren't necessarily, doing stuff. But they can still be useful. For example, when we want a answer to a simple question rather than an in-depth investigation. So there was this project from Europol called Trace an Object, Stop Child Abuse, where they had taken objects from child abuse imagery and were asking the public to identify that. And they had quite a small online presence. So we actually took that and we boosted that by sharing that with our online audience, creating a platform where people could go and identify this stuff and discuss it. And that helped identify these objects. And that resulted in, real impact, people being arrested, children being rescued. And then you have kind of the broader internet world who sometimes will encounter our work. So that's really how Bellingcat is structured in a sense of, how people get involved with it.
Yeah, and I guess because you have such a large community, how do you ensure that, the stories that are coming out, the data that's coming out is accurate, especially with so much misinformation going around, but so many people inclined to call different stories that they don't agree with or that disproves their worldview misinformation?
Well, that's the beauty of open source investigation. Everything that's part of the investigation should be publicly available. So if someone is coming to us with a claim, they should be able to point to all the sources. They should be able to go through step by step how they came to our conclusion. And we have an editorial team who will review that. We have staff who are experienced in investigations, and they know we are very aware of unconscious biases that can come into investigations that some people who aren't such experienced investigators won't think of, or avenues of investigations they may not have thought of, or explanations they may not have thought of for, analysis of a satellite image, for example. So we kind of use our experience and our knowledge to review that work. But what's key to this is the open source evidence, because that means that really anyone can get involved with an investigation, and really at the end of that, we can kind of review that in a way that's thorough, that's accurate, and will reassure us that, yes, this is true information.
So I guess how much has just the plethora of disinformation, how much has that affected Bellingcat's work? Because now we're getting AI generated images, AI generated videos. People can mimic the voices of different presidents, mimic the mouth movements. I think there were some comedic ones of President Biden giving his farewell address. But if you did not know who President Biden was, you could sort of assume that was real. So how has misinformation, but more specifically, these AI generated images potentially impacted the work?
Really, so far, very, very little. The way we work is very involved in triangulating sources.
Uh-huh.
The thing is, when there's an incident in the real world, it creates a kind of echo, through the network of the internet. A post is made, but that post isn't just unattached to other information. It's posted on an account. If it's an image, there will be information within that image. If it's happened somewhere in the real world, we can look at other information from, satellites, from other open sources about that same location at the same time to check that. So actually to create an authentic kind of network of information around an incident is very, very difficult. And the more effort you put into it, the more chance there is actually that part of that network will be identified as being false. So that's been quite useful. There are some issues that are starting to arise around with how people are figuring out how to, hide where something was photographed, for example. We are looking at one case at the moment where it was a photograph that was taken. I can't provide the specific details, but it was a photograph that was taken, and we believe they've used generative fill to change the background. So looking at it, it just looks like a normal background, but we're pretty certain that they've actually faked that part of that background to make it harder to geolocate. So there's those kind of things creeping at the moment, but so far it's not really causing that many problems in terms of investigation. But in terms of disinformation and trust, I think it's a really big issue because it's not so much that this stuff will convince people of something that's not true, more that it creates a permission structure for people to deny reality rather than saying, okay, we can accept a picture. They can say anything they want now is a fake picture, it's AI generated. And that becomes a real problem when it in terms of trust and actually being able to convince people who don't want to be convinced that something is true.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like we're seeing a lot of this with the war in Ukraine, but also the war in Gaza. I think there were like, I mean, I saw a Twitter battle between folks on both sides, sort of arguing about whether this just this destruction was AI generated, this baby was AI generated, etc. Which sort of leads me to a broader question about, I mean, what's the difficulty of sort of doing this work when it comes to like war zones, where, I mean, there's so much talk about the fog of war. There are so many heightened emotions around this, and oftentimes associated governments or associated non-governmental not NGOs, but I meant like paramilitary organizations is the better term, will often be obviously anti-press and will attempt to limit, distort, uh, contradict, what's being reported.
Well, I look at this in terms of information and evidence. In terms of evidence, it depends on the conflict. You have lots of different sources. Like we've just published a piece on Rafah in Gaza and the destruction of buildings that are creating a kind of exclusion zone that the Israeli military are building in that area. And that's something we can investigate using satellite imagery and also the Instagram posts of Israeli soldiers, because they are posting a lot of what they're doing in Gaza on Instagram. And that's become a really good source for various evidence of their misbehavior, actually. But in some cases, that can be very difficult because in certain countries, there's less availability of either satellite imagery or people who are filming stuff and putting stuff on the internet. So it varies to a certain extent. But there's more than enough to keep everyone busy with the amount of conflicts and social media and open source information being produced from them. In terms of information, it's an absolute nightmare at the moment because there are dynamics that are more focused on kind of emotional truths than evidence-based truths. And there are people who kind of feed off that. Especially, I've seen this with Israel and Palestine, where you have people who have picked a side and are producing emotionally engaging content to get as many clicks, retweets, shares, subscriptions as possible. And it's usually, lots of images that have been repurposed from Syria, occasionally images that are AI generated, or just misleading statements about genuine images to cause an emotional reaction to get that engagement. And really, that's not about finding a solution or understanding the conflict. That's just giving people what they want on an emotional level. And that's been really, really severe on both sides with the conflict in Israel and Palestine. And it's the worst I've seen it, really. It was pretty bad with Ukraine and Syria, but with this topic, it's terrible because people have been engaged internationally with what's happening in Gaza and Israel more broadly and Palestinian territories for a long time. So they already have made their minds up and they are looking for things that reinforce their opinions. And this is not unique to that conflict. In fact, that's a really widespread thing and it happens on lots of different issues. It's just this is one where I've seen it kind of it's the most kind of vibrant, I guess you could say, in terms of that.
I mean, it's basically like scaled up to it to a broad extent. I mean, like the Sri Lankan Civil War, for example, ended in 2009. A lot of atrocities, but I feel like the focus on that was very scaled down, very specific to certain communities and so on. But with Israel and Palestine, it feels way more scaled up. Everyone has an opinion on it, but also everyone's consistently sharing a lot of content that's just going viral almost daily by the hour. And I mean, how has Bellingcat navigated this particular conflict?
Well, really, we've kind of stuck to the principles that we've already always worked with. We've focused on the evidence. We've tried not to get engaged with the kind of emotional side of it so much. As I said before, fortunately, Israeli soldiers are sharing an awful lot on social media about what they're doing. So that's given us a way to document the conflicts, which combined with satellite imagery has allowed us to have some insight on what's going on in the ground. There's always going to be limitations, but there is still something that's possible with that. But I think one of the really big issues with what's happened in Gaza is that Twitter was a really important space for the open source community, and the moderation of Twitter to get rid of disinformation and fake news was really useful because it stopped the just nonsense flooding the entire website. But when Elon Musk took over, he unbanned a lot of accounts that were notorious for spreading disinformation, and they have been massive vectors in terms of the spread of disinformation around what's happening because they are grifters who have no shame and they are willing to share whatever emotionally engaging image they can find, which could be AI generated from another conflict or whatever, to get those clicks and likes. And those are the ones that are kind of really just flooding, as Steve Banning said, uh, flooding the zone with beep. So that's become a real problem. And it's annoying more than anything, but I think it's really important as well when we talk about disinformation to recognize where it's coming from. It's been so much focus since 2016 on investigating disinformation in terms of outside actors like Russia, fooling us and making us believe stuff that isn't true. But really, this is something that emerges from communities that feel a deep sense of betrayal and distrust in traditional sources of authority. So they turn to online communities who fuel that distrust, fuel that worldview, and in some cases, effectively radicalize people to hold in quite extreme views on these different situations.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the big things I've been curious about in terms of like a citizen journalism perspective is, I mean, we've seen sort of just like the internet cutoffs. We've seen just like inaccessibility to uh communications technology from time to time in Gaza. And, you mentioned, I think, using the resources of these IDF soldiers who are posting about some of just the terrible things they're doing, in homes and whatnot. And I think a lot of that information has been helpful to get, some analytical insights. But how has the maybe the prevention of information that's being able to go out, how has it impacted the manner in which you're able to cover an airstrike? I mean, every time like there's an airstrike or an explosion, there become these narratives that proliferate, and as he said, very emotionally tinged, that become truth for various
Yeah,
sides.
it's certainly complicated because of this kind of emotional element that's really been encouraged by the way, particularly Twitter has been allowing accounts that spread disinformation to propagate on the website. It's very limited as well in terms of what information we get from the side of the Palestinians. There is some information, but some of the restrictions can be as simple as the fact that they don't have enough power to keep the lights on at night, so that when video comes out, it is so dark that you can barely see anything. But there's still stuff that you can do with that. There was a good piece of investigative work that looks at one incident that used the analysis of the sound of gunfire and other information to actually establish facts about what was happening, even though the video was very hard to see anything that was happening. So it's more that you kind of have to sometimes eke out the information based on what information you're able to get from the ground. And yeah, these internet restrictions do make it difficult to get information from, the Palestinian side in the conflict.
Yeah, no. And I mean, has the Israeli government, come after, maybe certain stories at Bellingcat? Have other governments come after certain stories at Bellingcat, or even just the organization itself for maybe publishing information that is very negative about, what that government, what that military is doing?
I think the two that we're having the most problems with historically and at the moment, Russia has always been a problem, really since 2015 when we identified where the missile launcher that shot down MH17 came from. It really started with a media campaign from state media that escalated to government statements about Bellingcat, claiming that we're just amateurs who don't know what we're doing. We were targeted by phishing attempts on our emails on multiple times from Russian state actors. With the publishing of the stories we did on the Skripal poisonings, that led them to deciding that we weren't amateurs, but we were working for intelligence agencies, and that became the kind of official government narrative from us. And we've been spied on by the Russian government, so they really don't like us at all. More recently, we are getting some attacks from the pro-Orban media in Hungary because of work we're doing to train journalists in that region to do fact-checking and investigation, and that's happened actually only in the last week or two. And I think we're expecting to see a lot more from that. Basically, authoritarian states hate Bellingcat because we expose their wrongdoing, and the only way they can react is by attacking us, through information, through cyber attacks, and so on.
Yeah, and I mean, my next question, obviously, not to be a cynic, but what about the democratic states from time to time, I mean, the US government certainly doesn't have the perfect record on certain media operations. Has there ever been any issue with, Western governments in this regard? Probably obviously not to the extent of like the Russians trying to commit espionage on you guys, but
I would say generally not. I get the impression, I mean, because a lot of my early work was on Syria, we did a lot on Russia's involvement in Ukraine with MH17. Um, we've got a very good reputation, I think, among lots of governments in the West. So when we've called them out on stuff, they actually kind of respond to that. Like we did an investigation with Human Rights Watch and Forensic Architecture into the bombing of a mosque in Syria that was initially blamed on Russia or Syria, and it actually turned out it was a US airstrike that killed a lot of civilians. And because we did this investigation, it used open sources, it was extremely thorough. That actually forced the Pentagon to respond and put a statement out and admit, yes, they actually had bombed a mosque. They kind of like, well, mistakes happen with their explanation, but it was actually very rare for them to actually admit those kind of incidents were their fault. And I think that's because they knew of our reputation. I heard when flight PS752 was shot down in Iran, a Ukrainian flight, that Ukrainian investigators who went there and spoke to the Iranians said, don't even try to dismiss Bellingcat's work because they did the work on MH17. They know what they're speaking about, and you won't be believed because we quickly identified it was an Iranian missile that was responsible. So, and in that case, it was very quick that Iran did actually admit responsibility for shooting it down. So, I think we are recognized in the West, at least, that we aren't, some fringe group who are making things up, and that we are seen as a very respectable and authoritative organization when it comes to investigation. And that's really kind of reflected in the way they respond to us. And it's also reflected in the way that a lot of our work now is focused on using open source evidence in legal circumstances. So we've been working with the International Criminal Court on that. We've developed an entire investigative process that's specifically intended for court cases. So yeah, we've kind of just done more and more to build the kind of authority of our work that makes it very hard for any real democratic government to kind of dismiss our work.
That's super interesting. And I mean, I think you just passed the 10-year anniversary of Bellingcat's founding in July. And I'm curious about, I mean, how have you sort of observed the methods perhaps change? Have methods changed substantially since the founding in 2014?
It's more that as we've done our work, we've kind of come up with new ideas about how to investigate different things, new sources, new forms of, kind of analysis that we can do on stuff. Very early on, the first time we used shadows to calculate the time of day something was taken was during the MH17 investigation. And now that's something we use a lot. And it's actually something we've developed even further, where we can now say, if you have a photograph and you know the day and time it was taken, we can use the shadows to actually tell you the kind of areas on the planet Earth where that photograph could have been taken. So we kind of take these ideas and we keep developing and we test them and we use them in different ways. And that led us to developing this process for legal accountability using open source evidence. And we work a lot with people in academia to test our various theories and ideas that we've developed. We've worked more in areas of education. We do a massive amount of training. I mean, we've probably trained now 7,000 or 8,000 journalists, activists,
Wow.
researchers. And they are the people who are now at various news organizations across the world setting up open source investigation teams. So a big part of my work, my goal in 2014 was to get as many people doing open source investigation as possible. And thanks to all this training we've been doing, now there are a lot of organizations doing open source investigation as part of their work. And that was something that I'd always intended. And it's been really satisfying, especially from 2022 onwards with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, to see those organizations applying that and actually finding out more about the conflict through open sources than they traditionally would have done through their usual methods.
So you've been accused of being a part of an intelligence agency and slash organization in the past, but how does your work, how has it actually augmented the work of certain intelligence agencies? You just mentioned that the Ukrainians went to the Iranians and they're like, don't even bother refuting what Bellingcat did because we're confident in what they did.
Yeah, so I mean, we don't have any direct contact with intelligence services, but there was an article where a journalist asked the CIA rather unhelpfully what they thought of Bellingcat, and they were like, "Yeah, Bellingcat's great." And my book got a very good review in there, the CIA's book review. So that didn't exactly help with kind of the Bellingcat is CIA allegations. But what I think we've really observed, though, like I said before, with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, is when the State Department was releasing information about what was happening, they referred a lot to open sources. And that meant the open source community could then go and look for those open sources if they hadn't already found them, which meant you could actually build a lot of trust in what the government was saying about what was happening because you could go and find the videos, photographs, and evidence to actually support that. So I think it's more that it's shown the value of transparency when it comes to sharing information with the public. And, in a traditional intelligence process, open source information would become combined with other sources and it would make it something that couldn't be shared with the public. But I think this sense of separating that out and saying this is the information we've got and this is how we've analyzed it and we can share it with the public is something I think that's very valuable for building trust in governments. And I think that's especially important for the generation that grew up in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq and the perception of a lot of lies being told by the media and government about that.
Yeah, and I mean, like, do you think? I mean, actually, I think that's a really interesting case study, right, with the Iraq War. Uh, do you think that invasion, at least the media sort of coverage around that, and of course, we didn't find weapons of mass destruction there. Do you think that I mean, this is a weird question. Do you think that that would be possible in today's sort of day and age, I guess, with the proliferation of open source information, with the proliferation of open source data? Because I mean, information is now democratized. Like, I don't know if we had, I mean, we certainly didn't have those same capabilities for citizens to get this information back in '03.
Well, it's like now we have an account with Planet Labs who we can task satellites to take images of places pretty much anywhere on the Earth. And that's an amazing capability. I mean, 20 years ago, that's something only the CIA would have. And now I can log onto a website now and request a satellite is looking at a certain location. So, when these diagrams of trucks with chemical weapon laboratories are kind of presented, I think the question would be, okay, where's the satellite imagery of these trucks? Where's this information that you should have if these things actually exist? And having worked a lot on conflicts involving Russia, it's been interesting to observe how Russia has tried to present, falsified satellite imagery and various lies, and how that's been debunked very, very rapidly using open source information. I remember there was one case from 2022 where there was a video that was published online by the Donetsk People's Republic, and it was published on their Telegram channel, and it claimed to show it's a bit complicated. Polish-speaking saboteurs attacking a chlorine tank at a chlorine treatment facility in an attempt to cause a huge chemical incident. And really all you could see in the video was someone rolling around in grass, firing a gun and explosions in the distance. But that was debunked pretty much in minutes, because when they uploaded it to Telegram, they didn't realize that all the metadata was still in the video, and they had edited the video in Adobe Premiere Pro, and that adds loads of metadata that includes the net file name they used to copy the explosion sounds in, the exact moment they copied it in. We found the video on YouTube of the explosions that they had used, and then someone used like waveform analysis to match the exact explosion to the video, and that was done very, very rapidly. And that kind of debunking is really useful because it stops that kind of items of disinformation entering the ecosystems that once they're inside it, they will believe it and they will share it and they will always deny any fact checks. So that kind of having that, building that community in the way it exists now is really, really useful when it comes to governments who are trying to pull the wool over our eyes.
No, yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's really interesting because I mean that Iraq war question just came up because I mean j just came up as we were having this conversation because it's just like it's just so fascinating to just understand and see the tools that we have in terms of open source data. The fact that entire organizations, even companies, are being built around the usage of open source data information to draw insights, results that we just don't have. And I mean, I'm sort of curious now. Uh, a lot of just the general sort of media consumers, news media consumers, have been inundated with a lot of Israel-Palestine content, a lot of Russia-Ukraine content. Bellingcat certainly covering a wide range of issues. What particular issues are you observing, you're tracking, that you're identifying that are pretty big, but are maybe underappreciated in the media right now, or in the media sort of consumption circles right now?
I mean, there's certainly, Sudan and issues like that in terms of conflict are, really underreported because I think Israel and Gaza has really kind of drawn a lot of attention away from what's happening there. I think also there's just less interest in an international audience in, places like that, unfortunately, even though there are terrible, terrible crimes being committed there. But what we try to do at Bellingcat is the reason we teach other people and train other people and we build communities around investigation is so it isn't up to a few gatekeepers to decide what's looked at, what's valuable, what's worth investigating. It's about really democratizing that process and doing it in a way that's evidence-based, that isn't based on a process and it's verifiable. And a big part of our work now focuses on education and building communities. So something we're doing at the moment is developing course curriculum that can be used in a variety of different courses, journalism, conflict studies, environmental studies, about open source investigation and how to apply it to those fields. And we're working at universities at the moment to build investigative hubs that will bring people together from different disciplines to investigate a variety of different topics. It's been already done very successfully by Berkeley School of Law and their digital verification corps, which they do with Amnesty International and the other international universities. So building those networks, building those communities and those spaces where investigation can be done by people who make their own decisions about what's valuable, I think is really important, especially when we're moving away from a kind of information media model where we're moving away from the kind of traditional gatekeeps top-down model where editors decide what's going into newspapers, the newspapers owners do, the government decides what information is being released, to a model where people consume information on a more peer-to-peer basis. And I think for some people, that's a very frightening thing because they feel this kind of lack of control that now young people are going on TikTok and watching videos coming from all over the place. But I see that more as an opportunity to actually re-engage people with actually producing that information rather than them just being passive consumers of information. They can actually be part of that creation process. But if we don't educate them how to do that in the right way, and that's not saying you can only look at this topic and not this topic. It's saying, here's how you do a good investigation. Here's how you actually can fact check this stuff that you're seeing. We run a risk if we don't do that of creating a kind of two-tier media consumption society where the older generation is still thinking in terms of headlines, newspapers, and the 10 o'clock news, whilst you have a younger generation who is thinking in terms of TikTok, social media networks, and discovering their worldviews through that. And I think that can also risk in circumstances where there's situations that can build distrust in those sources of traditional sources of authority, that people seek these alternative sources of authority on the topics that they're interested in, and they just end up with we have like a sea of information bubbles where everyone's just being told the things that they want to hear, and the truth just becomes another information bubble because no one's actually doing anything with that truth.
I mean, it's the idea of the echo chamber, right? Like, I mean, especially when you have your social media algorithms that will cater information that you will most engage with, or even, on the other side of things, like very negative information that you're going to be drawn to react to, even if you don't agree with it. I mean, I mean, I did some work back in the day on sort of social media sentiment analysis, and it was just always so interesting how some of the most extreme information and messaging would often become the most viral, the most disseminated.
I think that's because looking at the different communities that have emerged around a variety of topics, I have seen the same pattern repeat time and time again, where take COVID, for example. Lots of people, searched for whether or not COVID vaccines were safe. And what that means is you are encountering information that is more likely to be from people saying it's not safe. You are having the algorithm thinking that you want more information on that, so it recommends you more content. Those communities who are discussing that also already have, an understanding of the topic that is already kind of established. It's kind of, the hymn sheet they all sing from. And that means you get exposed to slightly more extreme content. So it might be saying that actually vaccines, it might start off with, there's lots of additives in vaccines and they can make people ill, and therefore they have to take these additives out. But then the next level of that is that actually vaccines don't really make you well at all. They don't really do anything. It's just, a bit of a scam. But then the next level of that is actually vaccines are designed to harm you so they can sell you more medicines. Then it's the next level of that is vaccines are actually designed to make you die because they want to control the population. And it's Bill Gates is putting microchips in vaccines. Now, not everyone's going to go to the kind of top of that pyramid, but there will always be a small fraction that do, and they will always be the loudest and the most extreme in their opinions. And they will bring a lot of people up with them. And I think until we understand that process in terms of how disinformation and misinformation is spread, that will never actually be able to resolve these issues, because I've worked since 2016 with the counter disinformation community, and I think there's always been too much focus on outside actors being a main vector for disinformation. And in my mind, it's really the true believers. It's the people who see themselves as truth seekers and are part of these communities who will continue to create, spread, and grow their community. And because it's often, well, nearly always based off a deep distrust of some source of authority, be it the media, the government, medical officials, or some combination of them, that they will always draw in other people who have that same fundamental distrust, but may not have previously been exposed to that topic. So we actually saw with COVID that a lot of the kind of Syria chemical weapon truther community moved into COVID disinformation. And that's because they saw it through the lens of a distrust of the government and the media. So when the government said, COVID's this, COVID's that, they immediately took the other side and said, well, that can't be true because we know the government are evil liars and trying to pull the wool over our eyes on these other topics, so they must be doing it here. And that then exposed their content on chemical weapons in Syria to the more vaccine, anti-vax community types. And you kind of have the various bubbles start kind of crossing over. It's like a big Venn diagram coming into one big circle.
Like there's no nuance, essentially.
It's really so the way to look at it is the reason people are drawn into conspiracy theories is that deep sense of distrust. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a huge, huge motivator for a lot of people who lost trust in the government. Things like 9/11, big incidents where people have a really big shock and they're seeking some form of comfort, and they start losing trust in the sources of authorities that they've trusted before. And in crisis, that can be completely destroyed. And they actually start seeing themselves in complete opposition to that source of authority. So when, with Syria, the US was saying that Assad had chemical weapons, they were like, this is just 2003 all over again. And that's all the information they needed. All the fact checks, all the investigations, everything they could be given, they didn't care about because they knew the government was lying. They knew it was true that the government always lie. And that then starts giving them a lens through which they see the entire world, and it warps their perception, and they build entire communities around that who reinforce those ideas and lead some of those people to become increasingly extreme in their beliefs.
Yeah, it's scary. It's scary.
It is, and we need to really take this. We need to understand this. So I've been working on a model of information disorder, which is kind of a term to describe the kind of spread of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And I think really the way that's often been approached in the past is you look at that and you think, well, it's similar to that kind of top-down model of kind of media communication where you have gatekeepers, except they're, the Russian government giving the public disinformation who then are tricked into believing stuff that isn't true. Really, what's it more like is this? I would say there's four main actors and vectors in this. There's official government and political sources. There's the proxies, so that's fake news websites or state media, and then there's the opportunistic manipulators. These are kind of the grifters. They don't actually believe this stuff. They're just trying to build a following and make money from it. And then in the center of that, you have the true believers. And without the true believers, you basically just have three groups of, people lying to each other, which doesn't really change the public opinion. But if you have true believers, that's the actual heart, that's the engine of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, because those are the ones who will see the world through this kind of corrupted lens and build an entire worldview around that. And they're the ones who will just keep going on about this forever and ever. And the risk there is then you start seeing this. It's very important there's no kind of crossover from those bubbles into mainstream discourse. And I think the one place that's really fallen apart is the US, because you are seeing places like Fox News, Newsmax, seeking profit through appealing to a political mindset over really truth. And I, I think Donald Trump is a symptom of that. He's not the cause of that. He's really, the outcome of what happens when you just let any crazy person on the internet have their say on Fox News. And there's certainly been a lot of that. One thing we observed when we were doing a project into investigating COVID disinformation is you'd have a kind of daily cycle of Donald Trump giving his press conference about COVID where he'd say something mad. And then you'd have the alt-right media kind of cleaning that up, saying, oh, he's just trying to trigger the libs, or the libs are too stupid to understand what he really meant. And then that would end up on Fox News, Newsmax, and so on, kind of cleaned up even further, going back into the year of Donald Trump. And that cycle was happening every single day. And because that was coming through mainstream media, it was propagating to a massive, massive audience who was really believing this stuff. And I think that's part of the reason why you see this huge split that we now have in politics in the US. I mean, there's decades of culture war stuff behind that, but this is the point it's brought to us thanks to now this kind of internet ecosystem of effectively conspiracy theorists on the right. And that's not to say that doesn't happen with Democrats or anywhere else, but I think it's one of the most stark examples I can think of.
It's a very prominent example. And I do sometimes feel like we're seeing it a little bit more on the left now these days. I feel like the right has had it's been going on for a while on the right and in depth, but I don't know. I feel like I'm starting to see it now just proliferate just feeds on the daily, which scares
Well,
me.
it's like the with the Trump assassination attempt, where
Yes,
there's a
that
cohort, I think, who thinks that yeah, that it was all
it was
faked.
staged. Like I'm
And
getting
and
friends who ask
but
me that.
again, they've gone through that same process. They've lost trust in that source of authority, which we could say is the Republican Party or the right-wing media or whoever that may be. And there are people who are, obviously don't trust Donald Trump and they don't like him, but there is a subsection of those people who have, really extreme beliefs in that way. In the same way, in a sense, they've been radicalized in the same way that anyone else who becomes part of this kind of pyramid of radicalization is part of. There's always going to be a subset of people, especially on the internet, who hold the most extreme version of those beliefs. And I think it's the responsibility of, mainstream media, responsible politicians, not to engage in that and to reject that. And I think what we've seen in the US is often a complete failure to do that, and that's caused real, dangerous social issues.
Yeah, because I think especially with like the Trump assassination attempt, I mean, when you think of these conspiracy theories, this misinformation, you often think about, your quote unquote your crazy uncle who comes over for Thanksgiving or, for a visit. You listen to it for a bit and then it's like, haha, goodbye. But now, like, I think with that thing, I think probably like a wake up call, but like, I'm having friends like friends who you would not expect to believe conspiracy theories be like, oh, Trump didn't really get shot, did he? Like, oh, it's probably like masquerade or stage and all that. I'm like, no, he got shot, guys. He got shot.
And it's just the same process happening again and again, just with different communities and sub communities. And it seems in one sense that model is quite simple because you observe it time and time again in just all kinds of different communities from different ends of the political spectrum. I think also it explains sometimes when people look at communities they consider kind of far left and far right, that they seem to have the whole same views on things like Syria and Russia and stuff like that. It's because they're reacting against that those sources of authority, and it's bringing them kind of into alignment because of that. It's not really about left wing or right wing politics. It's about reacting against the mainstream politics. And it's something that's becoming increasingly endemic. And that's why a lot of the work we're doing at Bellingcat now is focused on education at secondary school, education at university, building communities of people who engage with stuff. Because I don't want to be in a situation where we go into a school, we're teaching young people the truth's really, really important. Here's how to find the truth. And then that's it. Because if the truth doesn't actually result in change, then it's no more useful than any other claim, allegation, internet bubble. It just becomes another bubble in a sea of internet bubbles. So we not only have to teach people how to find the truth, we need to actually tell them what they can do with that truth and help them do something with it, because otherwise it's just another bubble.
Exactly. Exactly. Elliot, on that note, thank you so much for joining me here today. We have to do something with these truths. We got to do something with the honest, factual information beyond just containing it in our own bubble. So I really appreciate the mission of you, the mission of Bellingcat. This was a fascinating conversation. So thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
That's great. Thanks for having me on.